Right, let me get my screen ready so I can see all of you lovely people. So we've had a couple of passages today, one from Leviticus 19 and one from Matthew 22. Now, I've always been a rule follower. Throughout my childhood and into my teenage years, I would rarely, if ever, break a rule. Now, if the teacher said, do not talk in class, guess what? I didn't talk in class. If my friends suggested we break the rules or bend them a little bit, I would be the voice of reason, telling them why it was a bad idea to go with that plan. If my parents said, do not ride your bike beyond the driveway, I would stay in the boundaries. And I was that student who, when the teacher had to leave the classroom for something, they would point to me to be in charge to make sure that the other students did what they were supposed to do. Now, rule keeping was never a problem for me. I don't know why, other than when I observed my friends, or particularly when I observed my brother breaking the rules and receiving the consequences, that must have had an impact on me. I didn't want to get punished for breaking a rule. And it could have also been because I've never really been a brave one, at least when I was really young. I was too scared to break a rule. If the authority figure had laid down a rule, then there must be a good reason for that rule to be there. Now, I want to tell you one story that may have impacted my relationship with rules. When I was very young, maybe 5 or 6 years old, we lived in a cul-de-sac in, here we say Birmingham, there we say Birmingham, okay? So Birmingham, Alabama. It was a quiet street. It only had 3 houses in it, and each of the houses had children in them. So we had this nice group of kids that would play on a regular basis up and down our street. Just over the property line of our house was this field. It was a large field, and it was filled with trees and shrubs. It wasn't kept very well. It just seemed to us like a vacant piece of land. But our parents informed us that it belonged to the man who lived at the top of the hill at the end of the field, okay? We were told never to climb over that fence and go into the field because it belonged to him. And he did not want anyone messing around with his property, especially children. And so we gave him a loving name. We called him Mr. Man, right? No idea what this guy's name was, but to us, he was Mr. Man, who owned the property that we were not allowed to go and visit. So what do the 5 to 8-year-olds do? What do you think? Well, of course, we wanted to go into the field. Tell a child not to do something, and it's likely they're going to want to do it. This was an unexplored territory, right? It needed to be discovered. We needed to scout out the land and see what kind of amazing adventures we could have, what lay beyond the fence. And so we did. One day we hopped over the fence into this unexplored new world, and you know what we found? Grenades. I see your eyes looking at me now. We found grenades. Before you get too excited, they weren't real grenades. They were pretend grenades. There is a type of tree that grows in Alabama called the magnolia tree. And it has a certain kind of fruit that is shaped like a grenade. And instead of using your imagination, I'm going to show you what that looks like. So this is a magnolia tree. And this is what the fruit looks like on a magnolia. That was like a grenade, didn't it? Let me open you up so I can see a few more of you here. So these filled this field next to our house. And when we jump over the fence and we see this amazing treasure, these grenades, what do the 5 to 8-year-olds do? Well, we have a grenade war, of course. So we rip them off and we start chucking them at each other, and we're having a whale of a time until one day, you know what's coming, one fateful day, Mr. Man catches us. He caught us in the middle of a grenade war, and I still remember it. I can see it in my mind's eye, shouting from the distance, "Hey, you kids, get off my property. Get off my land. What are you doing? Go on, get." He was shouting as he was running towards us. And so what do? Well, of course, we ran. We hurled ourselves over the fence, back into our yard, up into the treehouse that we had. We closed the doors and the windows, and we hid. And it felt like, hours, until Mr. Man finally gave up, and he went back home, and he was gone. Now, that experience of breaking the rules, it deeply impacted me. I was terrified of Mr. Man. And even as I tell this story, I kind of get a little bit anxious thinking about that feeling that I had when I knew he was running after it. Who knows what this Mr. Man was going to do, right? Let me stop sharing my screen. So why do I tell you that story? Today's readings are about following rules, like I told the children earlier. Leviticus, it literally means the law of the priest. It contains rule after rule after rule about how to live as the people of God. So there are rules about work, home life, relationships, worship, politics, rules about immigration, business, parenting, and it goes on and on and on. Now, if you've ever tried to read the Bible straight through, it's likely that when you get to this book, the third one in the Bible, you either quit or you skip it. Then you get to Numbers and you probably skip that one too. It's not unusual, as many of these rules, these laws, they need a lot of explanation and a little bit more study to understand what they really meant for the Israelites then and what they might mean for us today. So in the rising tide of all of these Levitical rules placed mostly in the negative, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, we find our reading for today. And it's a positively stated little gem in the middle of this book that talks about loving God and loving our neighbor. So I'm going to read it to us again. This is Leviticus 19, verses 1 to 2 and 15 to 18. So the Lord said to Moses, give the following instructions to the entire community of Israel. You must be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And then 15 to 18. Do not twist justice in legal matters by favoring the poor or being partial to the rich and powerful. Always judge people fairly. Don't spread slanderous gossip among your people, and don't stand idly by when your neighbor's life is threatened. I am the Lord. Do not nurse hatred in your heart for any of your relatives, and confront people directly, so that you'll not be guilty for their sin. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelites, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So no doubt this commands to love your neighbor as yourself. It reflects the declaration at the beginning of the chapter, those two verses that say, be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Now remember, we are created in the image of God. And so to be holy as God is holy is to do what we were created to do, to be who we were created to be. And he ends this by saying, love your neighbor as yourself. So the design of these rules was to develop within the Israelites, the people of God, a means of existence that reflected the nature and character of God. So remember God's covenant with Abraham. I will be your God and you will be my people. Then later to Moses, be holy as I am holy. So in other words, when the world looks at you, they need to see me. Now, by the time we get to our gospel passage in Matthew chapter 22, in the history of God's people, the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, the ones who really knew the book of Leviticus backwards and forwards, the ones whose job it was to ensure the people both understood and followed all of these rules, had come up with a list, like I told the children, of 613 rules. Now, I don't know about you, but if I had to remember 613 rules in my life, as much of a rule keeper as I am, I'm sure there's going to be some things that I forget or don't know or fail to follow or find it difficult to follow. Now, this is the situation that we find Jesus in our story in Matthew 22. He's been hounded. I don't know if you've recognized this over the last few weeks, but Jesus is being hounded in our readings by the teachers of the law with question after question after question. So Deirdre last week, the question was about paying taxes to Caesar. They're trying to um, force Jesus into a hole, right? Into a corner. They're trying to get him to maybe forget a rule, or to maybe not know a rule, or even break a rule. So today, the teachers try to get him again. This time, the question is one that was on everyone's mind. If we can't remember all of these 613 rules, then Jesus, tell us which one is the most important. That's a fair question. So now Jesus is put in kind of a difficult position. If he chooses one rule, then they will say he declares that there's a hierarchy of rules where some rules are more important than others. But if he chooses not to say anything, then they will win and their 613 rules will stand. But as he often did, Jesus responds in a very clever way. He says this: you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. Good answer, Jesus. This is a very important rule. This is called the Shema. It's something that all Jewish people memorize. It comes from the book of Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God alone. Okay? It's the marker that differentiated God's people with the other religions around. They have one God. So good job, Jesus. Love the Lord your God. But Jesus continues. And the second is like it. It's equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. And the entire law and the prophets, in other words, the entire Old Testament, are based on those two commands. Now, I imagine that as soon as Jesus says this, there is silence, right? They asked for what's the greatest command. They expected to trip him up. And then he gives them a profound response. So you're saying that our 613 rules can be summarized by two? Love God and love other people? That's it? All of the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. Search the whole book of Leviticus, and you will find that at the heart of each rule is to love God and love your neighbor. Now, it seems that Jesus here is asserting that love is the test of one's true understanding of the law. Love the Lord your God. Now, as I was preparing for today's sermon, I couldn't help but think, I'm a historian, if you didn't know, and I couldn't help but think of a medieval theologian who took what Jesus said very seriously. I'm going to show you who I'm talking about. So this is Bernard of Clairvaux, or you might say Bernard of Clairvaux. So as I was preparing, my mind goes straight to Bernard of Clairvaux. He took what Jesus said very seriously, and especially the first part of Jesus' answer. What's the greatest command? Well, it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. So Bernard of Clairvaux was a Christian monk who lived in the 12th century in the region of Burgundy in France. He's known for having established a monastic order. And if you have any questions about that, please send me a message. I'd love to talk to you about that. They were called the Cistercians. He's also known for his writings on grace and humility, on God, and he wrote some commentaries on the Bible. One of his most famous works is something called On Loving God. It was written in an effort to help his readers understand the depth of what it means to love God, the first and the greatest command. And so he begins, you want me to tell you why God is to be loved and how much? I answer, the reason for loving God is God himself. The measure of love due to him is immeasurable love. You can't love him enough. In other words, to know God is to love God, and to love God is to touch eternity. Now, there are lots of things that he says about loving God, but the thing I find most helpful in what he says is he describes the journey of loving God more and more and more. Remember, he said, to love God is to love him immeasurably. We can always love God more. And so he talks about this journey of getting deeper and deeper in our love for God. So he describes this as degrees of loving God. So, when we talk about temperature, there are different degrees. So we can go up or go down. I'm going to explain these to you and then reflect on how this relates to our passage today. So the 4 degrees of love. The first degree of love is when one loves themselves for their own sake. Now, this, simply put, is selfish love. It's love of the self. It's a love for the self that drives every decision that they make, the relationship they have, or the activity that they participate in. This degree of love describes someone who puts their own needs or their own desires before those of God or other people. It's just selfish love. The second degree of love is when one loves God for their own sake. So this is the point at which one recognizes that they aren't the center of the universe. They acknowledge that their existence does depend on God. Their relationship to God at this point is still, however, self-seeking. So they acknowledge God for what God can do for them. This person now knows God, but only on what we call a transactional level. In other words, if I do this for God, then God will do this for me. Okay? The third degree of love is when one loves God for God's sake. This degree is the point at which a person recognizes that God does not exist just to do stuff for us. God exists for relational purposes. We have been created by him, and his desire is to be known by his creation. So in this degree of love, the person develops a love for God which is rooted in a knowledge of God, who is love. So in other words, this person begins to love God because they understand that they have first been loved by God. And the fourth degree is when one loves themselves for God's sake. And the final degree of love is understood as the point at which a person becomes completely filled with the love of God. Every desire and action is pure. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. He describes it like this: as a drop of water is poured into wine, it loses itself and it takes on the color and flavor of wine. Or as a bar of iron, heated red hot, becomes like fire itself, forgetting its own nature. So in this person, all human desires and affections melt away into the will of God. So these 4 degrees of love, according to Bernard, describes this journey and this relationship that we all have with God. Here's a quote from Bernard. What we love, we shall grow to resemble. What we love, we shall grow to resemble. So what we learn from Bernard is that in order to love God, we need to know him. This requires an openness to God and a desire to know him more and more. And so when Jesus says that the greatest command is to love God, Bernard would say the greatest command is to know God. And when one knows God, they will love God. And Jesus then reminds us that if we love God, then we love God's image, which is our neighbor. So the beautiful thing about knowing God is that we're not left to our own devices. The journey of knowing God and loving God does not depend on our intelligence, our education, our wealth, our experience, or our ability. The beautiful thing about knowing God is that God has chosen to reveal himself to us. Hebrews 1, chapter 1 says this: long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets. But in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son, Jesus, whom he appointed as heir of all things, and through whom he also created the world. He is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being. And he sustains all things by his powerful word. God chose to reveal himself, to allow us to know him through the person of Jesus. So in the Old Testament, God revealed himself through the law and the prophets, and in the New Testament, God reveals himself through Jesus, the exact imprint of God's being. To know God is to know Jesus, and to know Jesus is to know God. So when Jesus asked what the greatest law was, instead of saying follow this rule or follow that rule, he said love God and love others. God's law, finally and forever, is a law of love. It's that simple, and it's that difficult. Because loving others means putting them first, not a selfish kind of a love. It means self-sacrificing. It means being vulnerable to the needs of our neighbors. All of this can be scary, which is why Jesus does not come teaching and preaching God's law. He lives it out. We see what God's law of love looks like in the life of Jesus. So just a few days after this encounter with these teachers of the law, Jesus gathers with his disciples. He took some bread and some wine, and he invited them by eating and drinking to share in his life of love. After that meal, he then would go out into a place that from this place of safety and to embrace his destiny, going to a cross, not to make God loving. There's nothing we can do to make God love us, but to show how much God already loves us. Because ultimately, the only way that we can love each other is to first recognize how much God loves us. And Bernard of Clairvaux, I think, helps us understand the journey of growing deeper and deeper in God's love. And so this is why perhaps the most faithful sermon on the law will ultimately point us to Jesus, where we discover that we, and when I say we, I mean all of us, are the center of God's love and attention, his grace, his mercy, now and forever. So what is the greatest command, Jesus? To love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, how do we do this? Well, to love God is to know God. How do we know God? He's revealed himself in Jesus. And that, simply put, is God's love for us in one sentence. I wanted to take a few moments in quiet as we get ready for communion. So if you would get your bread and your juice ready, and we're going to gather around our virtual table together. So spend a few moments in quiet